So this is the leap year program we had from the previous video, and we've got this quite complex expression here that determines whether a year is a leap year or not. Now this is basically okay. I mean, I think in practice you probably want to put a comment in here to explain the logic of what was going on, but these kind of combinations of ands and ors and so on can get very complex, and it can get rather difficult to follow. Now we could break this up with some Boolean variables. We could have year div by 4 or a year div by 100 or whatever variables in there and use those instead. But there's another alternative, and that is to use nested if statements, one if statement inside another. And that's what's happening on this program here. Now this one does exactly the same thing. It is of course quite a bit longer, and in this particular case I think probably this one is unnecessarily complicated, and I prefer the first one, but it does nevertheless illustrate the idea, and it allows us to more easily put comments in explaining the logic. Okay, so what we're basically doing here is saying, well, okay, I mean, first of all we need to check whether the year is divisible by 4, because all leap years have to be divisible by 4 as a starting point. Some years, like 1900, which are divisible by 4, are not leap years, but a year like 1903, for example, or 2001, could never be a leap year. So we can just simply check, is the year divisible by 4? And if it isn't, we can say, well, it's not a leap year, cannot be one. Now, however, in here, starting at this point and ending at this point, we now need to work out, well, okay, it might be a leap year because it's divisible by 4, so now we need a bit of logic to check that. So first of all we say is the year divisible by 400? Now notice we've got one if statement inside another if statement. These are called nested ifs, and you can have them as many inside each other as you want to, bearing in mind that if you overdo it, your code's going to be very hard to understand. But this one allows us to say and read the comments, all leap years must be divisible by 4, and lots of people tend to use ... to say this kind of is going to be continued. Now we can say here one's divisible by 400 are leap years. So we can simply say if year is divisible by 400 is a leap year. Now after that we can say, well, if that's true, we're finished. Okay, we're done. We've done this, and because we've done this, this is an else, this is an else. We don't bother checking these else's here. Once a condition in an if statement is true, like this one, we do not bother checking any other conditions like this one here. And it's just as well in this case, as I'll explain in a minute. Well, suppose this wasn't true and it wasn't divisible by 400. Well, okay, it might still be a leap year, but first of all we need to check to see, is it divisible by 100? Because if it is, it's not a leap year. Okay, so now we've checked this. This was false. We've checked this. If this was true, we print this message out. But if this is false, that means it's not divisible by 400. It's not divisible by 100. But we've already established it is divisible by 4. Therefore, it must be a leap year. Now, one other reason why this example is useful is it shows that these tests are done in order. So if you have an if statement and then you have one or more else parts, the way it works is that Java starts at the top and checks the first test. In this case, is the year divisible by 400? If it is, it does the code between here and here, this particular line in this case, and it then simply skips the whole of the rest of this if statement. It doesn't bother checking this. It'll only ever do one thing inside an if statement, one branch. Even if some of these other tests are true, the first one it finds that's true, it does that and skips the rest. Now that's just as well here, because if you look at it, if a year is divisible by 400, it's also going to be divisible by 100. It must be. But as soon as it's found that that test is true, it doesn't even bother checking this. It goes straight to the end. Now that means that if you're careful about the order you put your tests in, you can make a difference between making your code quite simple and quite complicated. If we tried doing this the other way around and said, oh, let's check to see whether the year is 100, and if it is, we'll print out this message here. Then you're in this position to say, oh, but hang on, if it's divisible by 100, it could also be divisible by 400, and it makes your logic more complicated than necessary. The general way to do this is to have the least likely thing to be true first, And in this case, because fewer years are divisible by 400 than 100, this is the least likely case. So put the least likely case first, and that tends to simplify the actual tests you have to do. This is an example of using one if statement inside another if statement. The outer one's got only one else, the inner one's got an if and a bunch of else's. And I'm not going to run the program because it does exactly the same as the last one. Well, actually I will, just why not? Okay, so you can see 1900 is not a leap year, but if I put 2000, it is a leap year. But something I don't like about this one is that we have a message here that's exactly the same as this message here, and we have a message here that's exactly the same as this message here. Now, I said in an earlier video and in the notes, DRY, dry, don't repeat yourself. This is bad practice. Having this message here repeated is not good. You might think, oh, I actually want to change one of these and I want to write something slightly different. The trouble is, at the moment, you've got to find and change several. So if you're going to write things like this and you do find yourself repeating things, use final variables. This is the same one as before, but I've put a final variable in called leap year and one called not leap year. And at the top of the program are two final strings which actually contain the text we want. Now if I want to change this message, I only have to change it once, and that's much better practice.